So AASB 10 consolidated financial statements, the key thing, we no longer have that bright line of more than 50%, you've got control, you have to consolidate. It's now a definition that has 3 criteria. And it says you will consolidate if the entity has power over the investee. And there's a lot of talk about what does power mean. So we have power over the investee. Also, the investor has exposure to rights or variable returns from the investment. And then the thing linking it, I've got power and I've got exposure to risk and rewards or exposure to returns, is can I use my power to influence these variable returns? So those are the 3 things. Do I have power? Am I exposed to variable returns? Can I use my power to influence the variable returns? And if I say yes to all of those, I control and I would consolidate. So brand new definition, no reference to any percentage in this definition. Therefore, if we push it to the maximum, you don't need any shareholding in another entity in order to control that entity. Right, so if in our earlier example, if you set up an entity on autopilot, you don't have shareholding, you don't appoint board of directors, but in the end, if that research entity come up with a cure for a certain cancer or a cure for AIDS, and that benefits will come to you and you'll have the ability to develop it into medicine, then you have the power over them to affect the variable returns. And power is not only voting power or a director, it could be you fund them, all right, or you provide guarantees. So power is not just shareholding. So wide definition. So how do we approach this assessment? I think today for our clients, for us it's important that you make this assessment as soon as possible and that we step through the process and say, do I have the power over variable returns? Should I therefore consolidate? Forget about my bright lines. How do I do that? A stepped approach, first of all, is to identify the relevant activities of your investee. Because if you have power over irrelevant activities, maybe admin activities, you won't consolidate. However, if you've got power over the relevant activities and exposed to variable returns, and you can use your power over relevant activities to affect variable returns, you consolidate. So what would be relevant activities? So that would be the key activities, the significant activities. So if we are an investment entity and I've got the decision on where to invest, how to invest, which portfolio, etc., then I'm in charge of, I've got power over relevant activities. If I'm a property company and I make the decision on what new properties we buy, in what location, the condition, the rental, the prices, etc., that would be relevant activities. The second one is to evaluate power, so who's got the power? And then the third one is to assess the returns and the variable returns. So there's a lot of guidance here on, if you look at power, is it only current voting rights? Because voting rights obviously is part of it. And that's the easiest way. If I've got voting rights, easy. But what about potential voting rights? So what if I've got convertible loans, convertible into shares? Should we take potential voting rights into account? Or what if I've got options to buy shares? Should I take that into account? And the standard, or the new standard, says we'll only take these potential voting rights into account if those options are substantial. What does that mean? They're in the money. There's actually a chance that we'll convert or exercise those options. Or maybe if they're slightly out of the money, if there's some synergies between the investor and the investee, that I would be willing to exercise these options, although they're slightly out of the money, to achieve other benefits or synergies. Right, so what you'll see in AASB 10 and all of these consolidation standards, there's no definitive right or wrong. There's just a list of things that you have to consider in making your judgment on whether you've got the power over variable returns and therefore consolidate. Right, so think about all these things, that's all they're saying. So if we look at an example to maybe illustrate this, if we've got two investors who form an investee and they want to develop and market a medical product, and as you know, with medical products, quite often it's really hard to get that approval through your medical council and the medical board. One entity is really good at that, and that's what they focus on. Another entity is good at the marketing going forward, or maybe the manufacturing going forward. So if we set up this new investee, question is, who has control? So who has power over variable returns and should therefore have control and should consolidate? So now we have to think about this, the facts and circumstances here, and can it change? The standard says there has to be a continuous assessment on whether we've got control or not. So can it change when we move from the one phase to the next phase? So very important that we think, so what's our business model? What is their strategy? So there's not a fixed answer. What is their strategy? If we've got a product where we still, let's say it's a new product to treat a certain cancer, to treat AIDS, quite revolutionary product, it would be really hard to get it through the medical board, to get approval to sell it to people. And if we think that whole process is really crucial, it will take a number of years. Not that the time is the only thing, but that's the crucial part. And once we've got that, the manufacturing marketing will be easy. One could argue that the entity that has the power over that process has the power and should consolidate. However, if we think, listen, this is just another kind of medicine to deal with a headache, whether it's Panadol, Nurofen, whatever, it's very similar. We think we'll get there across the line very easily. It's not a significant big deal for the product we're looking at. But where we're going to make money, and our business model and our strategy is how we're going to manufacture it really cheaply and market it really well. In that situation, you would say the entity that have control over the manufacturing and the marketing, they could possibly argue that they've got the power over the variable returns. They have control and they should consolidate. The continuous assessment question. I must admit, sorry, before I go to that, continuous assessment is true. However, I would imagine there to be some significant change in facts and circumstances to alter my assessment. I don't think you'll just alter your assessment going from we've got approval to, you know, we don't have approval, now we've got approval. Because right up front, when we set up this new investee, we knew what the circumstances were. We knew what the business model, the long-term strategy is. And to just change that once we get the approval, I think leaves me a bit uncomfortable. I would like other things to change, maybe a change in the contract, etc. But continuous assessment, definitely. The question that we would ask is, if we come, and I can imagine this happening, we look at our business model, we look at our strategy, and we think that both activities significantly affect variable returns. The standard says that's a cop-out. You have to say which one most significantly affect variable returns, and the person who has the power over that activity will have control and should consolidate. So somehow, some assessment of most significant. All right, so they're forcing us down a certain path. All right, so if we look at another example, so I said, what if it's not a medical product this time? Let's say one entity has control over manufacturing and another has control over marketing. So which one is the most significant activity or the most relevant activity in this situation? Again, you look at your strategy and your business model, and you would think, if I'm going to manufacture a low-cost item, I'm going to do the manufacturing really well, bring costs down. Maybe if you've got control or power over the manufacturing part, yes, you should consolidate. However, if it is a high brand item and the success will be how we market that high brand item, maybe the fancy shoes and stuff, or fancy luxury cars. If I'm control over the marketing, and the marketing is the key thing here, then I've got power over that. That would mean I've got control. So it comes down to what our business model is, what our strategy is, and an understanding where we're going, what the future holds, what we plan to do. So my two examples, it could either be low-cost manufacturer or maybe a high-end branded product, and who has the power over that part of the activities. The other interesting one, and although I'm proudly Australian, as you can hear, I'm not necessarily Australian born. Again, this really pains me. The Australians had this right all along, because before 2005 in Australia we had the concept of de facto control. And then when IFRSs came into Australia, we said no longer do we have de facto control, but now with the new AASB 10 it's back. All right, so you've got it right. And de facto control is really saying that we have to look not at that bright line of more than 50% to get control, but we have to look at who are the shareholders, how many shareholders do we have? Do they act together? Do they vote together? Look at past experience. Do they attend annual general meetings? So it's taking a more holistic view at shareholding and not just focusing on more than 50%. So I've got two examples to explain that. In situation A, I said, let's say entity A owns 40% of the shares in entity B, and let's say the other 60% of the shares are held by a number of other parties and shareholders, let's say 120 of them. So one entity has 40%, 120 shareholders have the other 60%. In the old days, so that would be about a year ago, in the old days we would have said entity A don't have more than 50%, don't have control, don't consolidate. Today in modern times and the new AASB 10, we would look and say, listen, entity A has 40%. If we now consider whether the other 120 people attend meetings, or maybe they attend meetings, but do they act together? Do they get together and vote together? And if we say no, it's really hard for 120 people to come together and make all the decisions together and manage this investee. Therefore, we could say that entity A has de facto control, and they have the power over variable returns. They have to consolidate, even though it's only 40%. Because it's not about a 40% anymore. It's about relativity relative to other shareholdings and other shareholders. To contrast that, if we've got entity A have 40% of the shares and the other 60% are held by two shareholders, and let's say it's David and Bala, you two have the other 60%, you two can get together over a coffee and decide to vote against me and I'm gone. All right, so in that situation, my 40%, although it's similar to the previous example, my 40% is not good enough to say I've got power over variable returns. And in that situation, I wouldn't consolidate because I don't have control. So it's not just the percentage, forget about percentage, it's now about relativity as well, looking at other shareholders as well. Now again, it can be a bit frustrating. We're moving from the safety of more than 50% to assumptions and judgment. And all they tell us is consider the following. So again, they tell us consider the facts and circumstances, and they say, look at contractual rights. So it's not only about shareholding, there could be contractual rights. And we saw that with special purpose entities. There could be contractual rights that determine where the findings go, where the research finding goes, who has the benefits ultimately. Look at contracts. It also says if you want to look at the size of your shareholding, consider other shareholders. Look at voting rights, yes, but that's not the only thing. Look at voting rights relative to other people. Look at whether they have to act together and how easily they can act together. Look at past experience, whether they have indeed acted together in the past. Right? So if it's only 5 people and it's easy for 5 people to act together, have they acted together in the past? Did they get together? Do they want to do that? How easily would it be to act together? So 5 would make me really uncomfortable, because I think it's easy for 5 blokes to go to the footy and decide to vote against me. All right? So that would make me uncomfortable. But it's, again, judgment that we have to apply. All right, if we look at de facto control, I think the biggest implication is something you should consider. Do you have associates that you account for in terms of equity method of accounting? Or in the past, remember last year are now the old days. In the old days, did you have associates which you've applied the equity method? Remember, in the old days, we said between 20 and 50% would be significant influence, and we would use equity method of accounting. So if you were in that category in the old days, I suggest we think about analysing all of those to determine whether we possibly have control. Because we no longer have the fixed 20 to 50%. We could have an old associate where we had a 40% interest. If we analyse the other shareholders and the shareholdings, consider all the facts and circumstances, we might have control and we have to consolidate. So the at-risk category would be old associates. To consider, are they really associates with just significant influence, or do we maybe have control and we have to consolidate? So that would be a target area to think about. Now, it's all about judgment. Right? There are no fixed rules, there are no strict rules, not in AASB 10, not in AASB 11 or 12. It's all about judgment, and therefore I think really important that we document our judgment and that you document your position, or whether you think you've got significant influence or control before the auditors arrive. Maybe up front speak to the audit partner on, this is our position paper, we think we've got control, or we think we still have significant influence for the following reasons. What do you think? Have the discussion, have the debate. So please contact us if you're in that category or in that risk area, so we can have the discussion up front. The last thing we want is when the auditors arrive, or maybe even worse, towards the end of the audit, if we realize we should have consolidated all along, and then it's a big rush to get it done. So definitely we need to apply our judgment, we need to document our judgment. Even if you want to say, I still think I've got significant influence, document why you think you've got significant influence. You don't have control, and we've got it in place going forward.